All right, welcome. Today we're diving into a philosophical concept, one we talk about often: autonomy, self-government, self-direction, acting on your own reasons and values. It sounds simple enough at first glance, right?
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Like, just thinking about an individual living their own life, making choices based on what matters to them. This idea is everywhere in ethics, politics, it's foundational.
Exactly. But you know how it is. When you dig a little deeper, things get a lot more interesting. And today, we're going to look at it all through the lens of feminist philosophy, a perspective that's always been a bit skeptical of this simple view of autonomy.
Right. Early feminist thinkers, they saw the way autonomy was talked about and they kind of worried it was promoting, well, almost like a very masculine ideal. This picture of the isolated person, all self-sufficient, reasoning alone, like in a vacuum, with no emotions or social context.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So the ideal is like a self-reliant individual, right?
Mhm.
Making choices all on their own. Feminist thinkers were saying, wait a minute, that's not realistic. Humans are social creatures, we're interconnected. And plus, this whole idea of autonomy kind of devalues things that are traditionally seen as, feminine, like caring for others, relationships, being interdependent.
That's it, exactly. They worried that if you define autonomy as the opposite of all those things, then you're basically saying women can't be fully autonomous. Like, there's something about being a woman with all the social expectations around connection and care that just clashes with the idea of being a self-governing individual. And that would mean denying women a lot of this social and political recognition that comes with being seen as autonomous.
And here's where it gets really fascinating. Because more recently, there's been a lot of work in feminist philosophy trying to, reclaim and redefine autonomy. They say to understand how gender oppression and things like objectification work, we need a good understanding of how and when autonomous choice gets messed up.
Yeah, the key idea is this. If you want to really understand gender inequality, you got to have a solid theory about how women's ability to direct their own lives, their agency, can be undermined. And it happens in very subtle but powerful ways. So the big philosophical question becomes, how do we rethink autonomy? How can we take those feminist critiques seriously and build a framework that actually helps us analyze gender dynamics?
And that brings us to relational autonomy. This is like the big alternative that feminist philosophy offers to those more individualistic, atomized views. It's a way of thinking about self-governance that puts our relationships, our social context, front and center. It's all about how those things shape who we are and the choices that we make. And that's exactly what we are diving deep into today, exploring these feminist perspectives on autonomy, and especially relational autonomy.
Before we go too far into relational autonomy, it might be helpful to quickly revisit some of the big names in this area, the foundational figures, just to get a sense of what feminist thought is responding to. Think about Kant, his famous idea that the will is autonomous when it's a law unto itself, independent of external stuff like desires. For Kant, being autonomous was all about being rational, being a moral agent, willing the categorical imperative.
Right. The will gets to make its own laws.
Right.
Based on reason, not on personal whims. And then you have Rawls with his idea of the veil of ignorance, where free and rational people come together to decide on principles of justice. They don't know anything about their own specific situation, their desires, so they can come up with principles that are, purely self-originating.
Exactly. And feminists have a pretty strong critique of these views. They say, look, both Kant and Rawls are relying on this idea of the isolated, atomistic self that we talked about earlier, and they both focus way too much on a very specific kind of abstract reasoning, like it happens in isolation. They don't pay enough attention to how much we are embedded in social relationships, how those relationships shape us.
Okay, so we've got a few core feminist concerns with the traditional accounts. First, they reject this image of the isolated atomistic individual.
Yeah.
Then they question this emphasis on self-sufficiency, like it's the most important thing. They challenge the whole myth of the self-made person.
Mm-hmm.
And fundamentally, they worry that this way of thinking about autonomy just doesn't fit with women's lives.
Okay.
It could even lead to, denying women social and political recognition.
Right. They're asking, can a theory of autonomy that ignores our relationships, our social embeddedness, really capture what it means to be a human agent, especially when it comes to social inequalities?
And that's where these failures of autonomy come in, these hard cases. They really force us to confront the limits of the traditional views. Let's start with self-abnegation, or excessive deference. This is about prioritizing others' needs and desires, even if it hurts you.
Think of Virginia Woolf's Angel in the House. Super sympathetic, charming, but always sacrificing herself. If there's a tough choice, she'd pick the worst outcome for herself every time. Andrea Westland compares this to Thomas Hill's deferential wife. This is a woman who always dresses how her husband wants, invites the people he likes, puts his career above her own friends and preferences, and she never seems to develop her own interests, or if she does, she don't value them.
Wow. It's unsettling, isn't it? You want to say, come on, this woman isn't in charge of her own life. But here's the thing. What if this is what she genuinely wants? What if she truly enjoys putting her husband first and values his opinion above her own? Can that be considered autonomous? It's a tough question. Just because you're acting on your desires doesn't automatically mean you're autonomous.
Right. And this is where Harry Frankfurt's idea of wholehearted identification comes in. If the deferential wife totally identifies with her desire to be subservient, if that's really part of her values and sense of self, then Frankfurt would say, yeah, maybe her preference is autonomous. Westland points out, this fictional character, she seems pretty happy with her subservient role.
But hold on. There's a big feminist counterargument here. Thinkers like Susan Babbitt, they say this whole pattern of servility, it gets so ingrained, it actually shapes who she is. It's not just a preference, it's woven into her identity. And if that's true, then autonomy, the idea of self-governance, it doesn't really apply anymore. She's not the kind of self that can be autonomous. It's almost like the question is, to be autonomous, do you need a certain level of independence from all those social roles and expectations?
Exactly. And the big feminist point here is that this whole deference thing, it's totally gendered. It doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's connected to how society conditions women, how they're expected to be accommodating, to put everyone else first. So even if it seems like a free choice, it's happening within a system of gender inequality. And that makes it really hard to say it's truly autonomous. It makes you think we got to look at how these social conditions shape our desires, you know?
Right. Let's move on to the next hard case. Adaptive preference formation. This is a tricky one. This is when your desires, your preferences, they adjust unconsciously to whatever your circumstances are. It's like that fable, the fox and the grapes. The fox can't reach the grapes, so he tells himself he didn't want them anyway.
Right. John Elster, he studied this a lot. He said it's usually unconscious, like a psychological defense mechanism. You want something you can't have, so to avoid that inner conflict, you change your desire. You convince yourself you didn't want it in the first place. It's like a blind spot in your mind. You don't even realize it's happening.
Yeah, like you get so used to oppressive conditions, you start wanting what's possible, what's expected of you, instead of what you might actually want in a fair world.
Exactly. And it's often tied to power dynamics and social norms. You adjust to the limitations placed on you because it's easier than constantly fighting a system designed to keep you down.
It makes me think of Martha Nussbaum's example of those poor working women in India, the ones who suffer abuse from their husbands. Some of them, they start to believe that this abuse is just, a normal part of being a woman. It's like their desires are shaped by the oppression itself. Instead of wanting a life free from violence, they accept it as their fate. These are deformed desires, when you actually start to desire the things that are hurting you.
Yeah, that's a powerful example. And we see this kind of thing in less extreme situations, too. Think about a college student. She's successful, smart, got a good social life, but she's always unhappy with how she looks. She spends a ton of time and money trying to meet these impossible beauty standards.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. It's like she's internalized these oppressive beauty norms, She thinks her self-worth depends on looking a certain way.
Yeah.
And it's all coming from these messed up societal values.
Right. Her desire for these beauty treatments, it's considered deformed because it's not coming from a place of genuine, authentic self-expression, but rather from oppressive pressures that she's absorbed without even realizing it.
So most feminists would say these adaptive preferences, they're not autonomous. If your desires are basically created by oppressive conditions, can you really say they're your own? But like with most things in philosophy, even within feminism, there are different views.
Yeah, there are. Serene Cater, she has this weak perfectionist view. She says even adaptive preferences can be kinda autonomous, especially if they're not, super harmful. If it doesn't completely destroy your well-being, there might still be some agency there.
And Marilyn Friedman, she goes even further. She says, even a woman who chooses to stay in an abusive relationship could be acting autonomously. If that's really what she decides, after thinking it through, based on her deeply held values, even if those values seem problematic from the outside, it's a complex situation, isn't it? It makes you wonder, how much weight should we give to someone's subjective endorsement of their choices, even if those choices are influenced by oppressive circumstances?
And Westland, she adds another layer. She says, women can commit to practices or norms that seem subordinating and still be free and authentic in doing so. As long as they're prepared to justify that commitment to others, to explain their reasoning, even if they're not totally convinced themselves, it's about that social accountability piece, being able to explain and stand by your choices, even within a restrictive social context.
Okay, let's get into the third hard case. These are situations where people seem to knowingly choose practices that look oppressive from the outside. And it's not just about adapting unconsciously. It's about consciously embracing these practices. We're talking veiling in certain cultures, arranged marriages, and even female genital cutting.
Right. It's about recognizing that sometimes people, especially women, actively participate in practices that might seem limiting or harmful from an outsider's perspective. And this raises tough questions about agency, autonomy, and the limits of cultural relativism.
It makes me think of Uma Narayan's work on the Sufi Pirzadi women in India. They practice purdah, living in seclusion and wearing veils in public. They know it limits their access to education and their freedom to move around.
Mm-hmm.
But they also say it has benefits, like modesty and a higher social standing than other Muslim women who don't practice it. It's not a simple situation. These women are navigating these constraints, and they're finding meaning and value within them.
Exactly. And it challenges us to grapple with the question of internalization. Can a constraint become so deeply internalized that it's no longer experienced as a constraint, but rather as a source of identity, value, or even empowerment?
So is it ever possible to freely embrace something that limits your choices?
Some theorists, like Marina Oshana, say no way. They argue that these kinds of restrictions, especially when they're severe, they just inherently undermine autonomy. It doesn't matter if someone says they agree with it. If you don't have real options, if you don't have freedom to act, then you're not autonomous, period.
Makes sense. But other thinkers, they push back a bit. They say, hold on, we can't just assume all women in these situations are helpless victims. Maybe they can accept these conditions autonomously, especially if they find personal meaning or cultural significance in them. It's about respecting their agency,
Yeah, I agree. Like Diana Myers, she brings up female genital cutting. She says some women who go through with it, they might be prioritizing their cultural traditions or their chances of getting married over what we might consider bodily integrity. She argues that we don't have enough cross-cultural agreement to say these choices are always non-autonomous. It's about finding that balance, upholding universal ideals of autonomy, but also respecting different cultures.
Yeah, definitely. It's a tough balancing act. And it highlights how tricky it is to think about autonomy when we're talking about gender and oppression.
Absolutely. These hard cases, they really show us the limits of those traditional individualistic theories of autonomy. They don't quite grasp the impact of internalized oppression and how restrictive social conditions can shape our choices.
And that's exactly where relational autonomy comes in. It's an attempt to grapple with those complexities, with how these social and relational factors affect our ability to direct our own lives.
Right. To understand relational autonomy, it's helpful to compare it to what some call the thin or minimalist theories. In these views, like those put forward by Sarah Buss and Uma Narayan, you're basically autonomous as long as you meet some very basic conditions.
So basically, as long as you're not severely mentally ill or suffering from some major cognitive impairment or being directly coerced.
Exactly. So a lot of the people in those hard cases we discussed, they'd probably be considered autonomous under those minimalist views. The deferential wife, the woman with adaptive preferences, even the woman who chooses to veil, because they're not experiencing extreme coercion in a legal sense.
Right. So these minimalist views, they do have some advantages. Like they set a pretty low bar for autonomy, which limits when the state can interfere in people's lives. But the problem is they miss a lot of the subtle ways gender norms and oppression can shape our agency, even if it's not blatant coercion.
Exactly. It's like they're missing the whole point of those hard cases, which is even these less obvious factors can have a huge impact on autonomy. But the traditional individualistic theories, they don't have the tools to explain how.
And that's where relational autonomy comes in. These theories really try to dig into those complexities. They want to understand how our relationships and our social context actually shape our ability to be self-governing. And there are a few ways to categorize these theories. One is the distinction between procedural and substantive accounts.
Yeah, that's a key distinction. Procedural theories, they focus on the internal process. How does someone arrive at their preferences, their choices? Do they think critically about them? Do they really examine their own beliefs and values? And these theories are often content neutral, meaning The outcome, the actual choice, doesn't matter as much as the process.
So if you go through this critical reflection process, then whatever you choose is considered autonomous. It's like Frankfurt's wholehearted identification, right?
Yeah.
Or Christman's idea of non-alienation, where you wouldn't reject a desire if you knew its whole history.
That's it. The focus is on how you come to have a preference, not so much on the content of the preference itself.
Right. But then there are substantive accounts. They say, hold on, it's not just about the process. Autonomy has to be about values, too.
Yeah.
And within this, you've got strong and weak substantive views.
Yeah. Strong substantive theories, they basically say, look, some choices are just wrong no matter what. Like choosing to be enslaved. It's inherently incompatible with autonomy, even if you somehow went through a whole reflective process to get there.
So according to these views, there are certain things you just can't choose autonomously because they violate some fundamental moral principle or value.
Exactly. And then you've got weak substantive views. They say, okay, maybe you don't need specific restrictions on content, but you still need some basic values in place, like self-respect. You have to value yourself to be truly autonomous. It's like a built-in requirement for genuine agency.
So a strong view says you can't autonomously choose this because it goes against what autonomy is. And a weak view says to be autonomous, you got to have this basic self-respect, and that will probably guide your choices.
Exactly. And there's another important distinction: causal versus constitutive relationality.
Right. Causal accounts acknowledge that our social relationships, our upbringing, the historical context, all these things can influence our ability to develop autonomy. But they don't define what autonomy is.
Yeah. Think about Annette Bayer's idea that we are all fundamentally second persons, meaning our very sense of self is shaped by our interactions with others, especially those who care for us. Or Jennifer Nadelsky, who argues that our autonomy is actually nurtured and supported within relationships, not in isolation. These are examples of causal views.
It's like they see social connections as a crucial factor that can help or hinder our development as autonomous agents, but they don't necessarily define what it means to be autonomous.
Yeah, exactly. But constitutive theories take it a step further. They say these social and relational factors, they're not just influences, they're built into the very definition of autonomy. Certain social conditions are necessary for it to even exist.
I see. So, for example, Oshana's idea that you need de facto power and authority to make important life choices, or Breeson's argument that you need a decent range of options to choose from, those are constitutive views. They're saying it's not just about your internal state, it's also about the world you're in.
Precisely. It's not just that relationships shape our autonomy, it's that certain kinds of social arrangements are preconditions for autonomy. Without those conditions, genuine self-governance becomes impossible.
Okay, so we've got procedural versus substantive, and causal versus constitutive. Now, how do these actually work in practice?
Well, it's not always clear-cut. They can overlap in interesting ways. Like procedural theories often acknowledge the influence of things like oppressive socialization. They'd say, yeah, that can mess with your ability to reflect critically. And content-neutral theories, they can also have constitutive elements, like Westland suggests.
And weak substantive theories, they often end up being causally relational, because our self-regarding attitudes, like self-respect, those are shaped by our social interactions. And of course, strong substantive theories, they're almost always constitutively relational, because you're judging the autonomy of a choice based on some external standard.
Right. The whole point is that the content of the choice has to line up with some external criteria to be considered autonomous. It's not just about your internal processes.
All right, let's dive a little deeper into some of the specific theories, starting with procedural ones, like Marilyn Friedman and Diana Myers. These are appealing to feminists because they're committed to content neutrality. They don't want to tell people what to value, what kind of life to live.
Exactly. It's about respecting individual differences, acknowledging that people's values are shaped by so many things: race, class, gender, you name it. And it helps avoid those paternalistic situations where someone else gets to decide what's good for you.
Right, you get to choose your own path. So generally, procedural approaches, they say that an autonomous agent is someone who can reflect on their desires in the right way. Sometimes they use hierarchical models like Frankfurt's, where you've got different levels of desires, and you achieve autonomy by endorsing your desires at the highest level.
Yeah, but those more static models, they can run into problems. Like, what if someone manipulates you into endorsing a desire that's not really yours? That wouldn't be autonomous, would it?
Definitely not. That's why Friedman and Myers, they emphasize the importance of the historical and social context of your reflection. Like Christman's idea of non-alienation. You wouldn't reject a desire if you knew its whole history, how it came to be. And Friedman has this similar idea, reflective endorsement. You're acting autonomously if you're acting on desires you've truly thought about and endorsed.
Right. It's not just about having a desire. It's about examining it, seeing if it lines up with your deeper values.
She has this example, a controversial one, where someone chooses to stay in an abusive relationship because of their religious beliefs about marriage. If they really thought it through, if it fits with what they truly care about, Friedman says, well, it meets her threshold for autonomy. But she also says this person might be less autonomous than someone who rejects those kinds of norms.
It's like a spectrum of autonomy, depending on how much you've critically examined your desires, especially if they're connected to potentially oppressive norms.
And Myers, she talks about autonomy competency. She says the true self, the authentic self, it comes from developing these agentic skills, self-discovery, self-definition, self-direction. And she argues that gender socialization can really mess with how these skills develop. Like for women, sometimes it strengthens self-discovery but weakens the other two.
It's like how we're socialized into our gender roles can impact our ability to define ourselves and direct our own lives. And it can play out differently for men and women.
And she makes a point of saying, even a well-integrated self needs to be looked at carefully, especially in complex cases like female genital cutting. And she talks about how education can help people become more autonomous by teaching them to introspect, to use their imaginations, to put themselves in other people's shoes.
It's about giving people the tools to question what they've been taught, to consider alternative perspectives, to imagine different ways of living.
And one more thing about Myers, she says you need self-respect to be fully autonomous, which is interesting because self-respect, that's a value, right? So maybe her view isn't completely value neutral.
It's a good point. Even though she wants to stay neutral about people's specific life choices, she's saying self-respect is non-negotiable. It's a weak substantive element in her otherwise procedural account.
Okay, so looking at Friedman and Myers, we can see some key features of these procedural approaches. First, they're causally relational. They recognize that stuff like socialization, your relationships, all of that shapes your ability to reflect and develop your sense of self.
And they see autonomy as something that comes in degrees, not just a yes or no thing. The more you reflect, the more sophisticated your reflection is, the more autonomous you become.
And they reject that whole idea that you have to be super rational to be autonomous. Emotions matter. Even unconscious thought processes can play a role. And Myers, she's really trying to grapple with how complex the self is, with all its contradictions and competing desires.
Yeah, they're moving away from that simplified, hyper-rational picture of the autonomous agent.
But procedural theories, they've got their critics. One big concern is they don't really address internalized oppression. Like, what if you internalize some messed up stereotypes or norms, and then you reflect on them and say, yeah, this is what I believe. You could meet the criteria for procedural autonomy, but your beliefs are still coming from a place of oppression.
Exactly. And they also don't always give enough weight to external conditions. If your options are super limited because of social or economic factors, can you really say your choices are autonomous, no matter how much you reflect?
Like Benson, he criticizes Chrisman's view, saying, sometimes oppressive norms are so deeply ingrained, you can't just think your way out of them. Your whole framework for thinking is shaped by those norms.
Right. Sometimes individual reflection isn't enough. You need a different kind of change, a change in the social structures and power dynamics that shape those norms in the first place.
And this leads us to a different set of theories. Normative competency conceptions. These aren't just about whether you endorse your desires or reflect on them. It's about your ability to understand and apply the right norms, the right values.
Yeah, so Gary Watson, he says it's not enough to just act on your desires. Even if you've thought about them really hard, your actions have to come from your values, your deeper sense of what matters. But of course, if those values are the product of internalized oppression, then we're back to square one.
And then there's Susan Wolf. She's got this influential idea. She says to be autonomous, you need the ability to recognize and be guided by objective moral reasons.
Right. Like, she has this example, Jojo. He's the son of a dictator, raised in a totally messed up moral environment. Even if Jojo reflects on his values and says, yeah, I want to be a tyrant just like Dad, Wolf would say, he's not truly free or morally responsible.
Because his upbringing has basically warped his sense of right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
For Wolf, being autonomous means being able to see and respond to moral truth. If you can't do that, you're not really free.
Exactly. And Benson's early work on normative competence is similar, but there's a key difference. He's not necessarily talking about objective morality. He's saying To be autonomous, you need to be able to figure out and use the norms that are relevant to whatever you're doing.
So, like, if you're in a particular social situation, you need to understand what the rules are, what's expected of you, and how to act in a way that makes sense in that context. And he says our actions, they show how well we understand those norms.
Right. It's about being able to navigate the social world in a competent way, understanding the norms, and acting in accordance with them.
He points out three things about normative competence. First, it's other-directed. You got to think about how your actions will be seen by other people. Second, it depends on the specific norms in that situation. And third, it's all about your relationships, your connections to other people.
It's inherently social. You can't be normatively competent in isolation.
And Benson says oppression can really mess with your normative competence. It can lead to false consciousness, to those deformed desires we talked about. You might not even be able to see the right norms, the just ones.
Or you might be stuck with contradictory norms, ones that pull you in different directions and make it impossible to be truly competent. It's like the very act of trying to be normal, to fit in, can be self-destructive if those norms are designed to keep you down.
And he suggests that sometimes you need to create new norms altogether, like through consciousness-raising movements, where people come together to challenge those oppressive norms and build something better.
It's about collective action, about creating a new set of norms that are more just, more equitable, more conducive to genuine autonomy.
And it's important to remember, normative competence, like Wolf's moral capacity, it's about being able to do something, not about always doing it. You can be competent and still make bad choices.
Right. It's about having the capacity, the understanding. You might choose to act against those norms, but you're doing it consciously with an awareness of what they are.
But these accounts, they've got some problems too. Like, where do these norms come from? Are they objective, like Wolf says? Or are they just relative to different social groups, which can get messy if those groups are oppressive?
And what about cases where someone is perfectly competent in applying oppressive norms? Like our college student who's mastered the art of meeting those harmful beauty standards. Is she autonomous in doing that? It seems like Benson's account might struggle with these kinds of cases.
And then there's this whole issue of mixing up autonomy with moral responsibility. Just because someone doesn't understand morality, does that mean they're not autonomous? It's a tricky question. And Benson himself ended up revising his view to address some of these concerns. Okay, so we've talked a lot about these rationalistic accounts of autonomy, all about reflection and norms and stuff. But some feminist thinkers say, hold on, there's more to it than that. They say, certain emotions and self-regarding attitudes are also necessary for autonomy. And guess what? Oppression can mess with those too. Things like shame, low self-esteem, self-doubt, lack of self-confidence, and self-trust.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It's not just about thinking clearly. It's about how you feel about yourself, your sense of your own worth and competence. And those things are deeply intertwined with our social experiences, especially when it comes to oppression.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
And Trudy Gouvier and Carolyn McLeod, they make a strong case for the role of self-trust in all of this. Gouvier argues that you can't really engage in that critical reflection process, the one that's so central to procedural autonomy, if you don't fundamentally trust yourself, if you don't believe in your own ability to judge and decide things.
Right. It's like the foundation for the whole reflective process. And she uses examples of survivors of rape and incest to show how trauma can totally erode self-trust. It's like the very ground you stand on gets pulled out from under you.
And it's not just self-trust in isolation. It's connected to self-respect, self-esteem, that whole sense of yourself as a worthy, capable person. And she's very clear, this is all causally relational. Bad experiences, especially in your relationships, can directly impact your emotional state. And that, in turn, affects your capacity for autonomy.
It's a powerful reminder that our emotional well-being is not separate from our autonomy. They're deeply intertwined. And oppression can target our emotions just as effectively as it can target our opportunities or our access to resources.
McLeod, she focuses on self-trust in medical contexts. She tells this story about Anna, a woman who has a miscarriage, and no one around her acknowledges her grief, her pain. And McLeod argues this lack of recognition, it can damage the woman's sense of her own competence. Like she starts to doubt her ability to understand and articulate her own emotions.
And that loss of confidence, that diminished self-trust, it spills over into other areas of her life, including her ability to make decisions about her own health care. It undermines her sense of agency, her belief in her own capacity to navigate the world and make choices that are right for her.
Right. And McLeod is very specific about what she means by self-trust. She calls it optimism about our own competence and moral integrity. So it's not just about trusting your judgment. It's about believing you're a good person, a capable person. And she also talks about justified self-trust. Your self-trust should be based on reality, on a fair assessment of your abilities.
So it's not just about feeling good about yourself blindly. It's about having a well-grounded sense of your own strengths and limitations, which is shaped by how you interact with the world and how the world responds to you. This makes her view weakly substantive because of that moral element and constitutively relational because your self-trust depends on whether your assessment of your competence actually lines up with reality.
Yeah, it's not just about your inner world. It's also about how the world sees you, how it treats you. And Benson, he adds to this with his example of a woman whose husband is a doctor. He dismisses her, calls her hysterical, just because she's got a more lively personality.
It's a classic example of how medical authority can be used to pathologize and control women, especially within intimate relationships where there's already an imbalance of power. It's about who gets to define what's normal, who gets to set the standards for behavior and emotional expression.
And Benson argues this kind of labeling, this invalidation from someone you trust, it can really damage your self-confidence, even if you're still capable of thinking critically. And because she trusts her husband, she trusts the medical establishment, she might not even fight back. She accepts his judgment as the truth.
It's a powerful example of how oppression can operate on multiple levels. It's not just about restricting your choices directly. It's about undermining your belief in yourself, making you doubt your own perceptions and experiences.
And Benson says this is a loss of autonomy, even though there's no obvious coercion. It's about that internal erosion of self-worth, that sense of not being in control of your own narrative.
Exactly. These accounts, they offer a new way of understanding those hard cases we talked about earlier. Even when someone seems to be reflecting and making choices, those choices can be influenced by these subtle, insidious messages of inferiority. The deferential wife, for instance, she might have her reasons, but if she doesn't truly believe in her own worth, can we?